Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Junia Doan's The Spark. I'm Junia Doan. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is American political scientist, speaker, and best-selling author on men's and women's issues, Warren Farrell. Welcome, Warren. Warren, you had a very early interest in supporting women and women's lib. How did that come to you as something of interest and to support?
Well, I was in New York City and the women's movement surfaced, and it just made sense to me that many women in my high school class were really brilliant, and the guidance counselor was saying that, well, you could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, you could be this or that. And my sister was 2 years younger than I, and she oftentimes was interested in a guy, but she was not like super beautiful, and so she felt oftentimes that she didn't have the social permission to be able to reach out and ask for who she wanted to be to go out with without fearing rejection and being out of place. And so the women's movement's initial messages to me just made perfect sense. And so I was doing my doctorate at NYU, and I was teaching also at Rutgers at the same time. And the students in my class said, when you talk about the women's movement, Warren, you have fire in your belly and you're doing a dissertation on something different from that. You should change your dissertation topic and focus on the women's movement. And so I did. But in the process of doing that, I did some quote research by going to the National Organization for Women meetings in New York City, but I took a liking to it, and they took a liking to me. And long story short, eventually they asked me to run for the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. And so then that led to my speaking all around the world on women's issues and doing a lot of things like the Today Show and writing for the New York Times and doing all that type of thing to support the women's movement. And then I began to see. I wrote a book called The Liberated Man, and when I was speaking on it, I began to also hear from teachers mostly that some of the boys in their class were having problems, and so that began to make me aware of boys and men's issues as well. And then when I began to bring up the importance of fathers, in particular for boys and men, the board members of the National Organization for Women in New York City, they were much more critical of me, and they just became silent when I started to understand that boys and men also had issues. And that was the first fissure of tension between me and the National Organization for Women's Board of Directors.
So, could you ever have expected your early efforts and other people's efforts at the women's lib movement, so to speak, has wrought what it has? Are you pleased with it?
Well, I'm pleased and I'm displeased. The pleased part is that that women have opportunities today and think of themselves as being anything that they want to be in a way that was definitely not true for my sister or the bright women in my high school class. And they also have opportunities they have social permission to, when they have children, to either be full-time involved with their children if they're married to a man who's reasonably successful, or full-time involvement within the workplace, or do some combination of both. And that's wonderful. And so, I'm just so happy that to see women involved in sports from an early age, because I think sports really teaches you how to work with other people and if you get involved in team sports with a supervising coach, it teaches you how to take orders, modify. If you're involved with pickup team sports, it teaches you how to be a creator, an entrepreneur, because you have to devise how those team sports are being played, and who to, whether to make the basketball court a half court or a full court, and who to choose and who to pass off to, and all those things are good preparations for being economically successful. And so there's so many things that the feminist movement has opened up the doors for women. On the other hand, one of the things that's really important is I've always been in favor of having a great deal of respect for women. And when I feel that the feminist movement has specialized recently, especially in honing victimhood as a fine art, and having and cashing in on victim power, and say and that and respect for women, respect for anybody never comes from them always focusing on how I'm a victim. It comes from being able to take responsibility. And I think the feminist movement has been an enormous failure in that area. They've really cashed in on defining themselves as victims, and especially in universities, especially in the liberal arts and social sciences, where so oftentimes speakers are not even allowed into the university as part of cancel culture, if they're conservative. And to me, a university should be about every perspective being enjoyed, and opportunity for learning how to criticize that perspective, how to see what's correct, what's incorrect, and it's all part of the education process. And doing things like requiring certain amounts of women to be in certain professions, as opposed to encouraging them to educate themselves in those professions. But affirmative action, I think, is good for a generation or two, but after a generation or two, it loses its purpose and becomes a form of discrimination in favor of somebody that hasn't necessarily earned it. And so the feminist movement has had its good sides, and unfortunately, increasingly recently, its bad side.
What I noticed over the years is they've become what they didn't like. They've become oppressors in certain
Yeah.
senses. And they don't have the awareness to see that, and maybe not the desire to,
Mhm.
who knows. And so I'm interested in your work with men and their effect on boys. Something I read about that you said, but of course not to me because I read about it, was that if there was a single parent family you preferred or suggested, the better choice would to be the male as a single parent. Could you tell us more about that? If you
Yes.
said it.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me sort of build the building blocks for that. So what I began to see was that there was a real desire to have single mothers be involved with children, to the point where today 42% of children that are born to single moms. And then, secondly, was in divorce situations where a very high percentage of the time when there is a divorce, that the children end up losing their contact with their dad. And I began to see that as I studied this in preparation for the boy crisis, I started seeing that that the boy crisis resides to a large degree where dads do not reside, and that when boys in particular, when girls or boys grow up with minimal or no father involvement, what I call dad deprived, I began to see that those dad deprived children did worse in more than 50 different areas. And almost most of the areas were the same and overlapping between boys and girls, but they were more intense for boys. So boys were much more likely to become addicted to drugs, addicted to video games, addicted to die from opioid overdoses, become depressed, become suicidal than girls were, even though girls were more prone without their father to have all those challenges as well. girls were much more likely, if they didn't have a father involvement, to become pregnant out of wedlock when they were teenagers, which usually did not do well for their children or do well for the young women that became pregnant out of wedlock as teenagers. And so I began to see all of these things being complex, and then I started saying, well, why is it that fathers are important? And I began to sort of see that there were basically 7 or 8 differences in what I that I ended up putting in the Boy Crisis book on the differences between dad style parenting and mom style parenting. And so, example of one of those differences is dads were far more likely to roughhouse than moms. And moms would look at, let's say, the dad and mom had 3 children, and 2 of them were, let's say, boys, and one was a girl. And the dads would tend to throw the 3 young kids on the couch and say, "Okay, let's get into some roughhousing here. Here's the game. The 3 of you, if the 3 of you can pin me down before I can pin all 3 of you down together, okay? Oh, that's great, Dad. Let's go for it." And the mom would be looking at the dad and going, "Oh my God, I feel like I have just one more child to monitor called the dad." And I'm afraid here that somebody's going to get hurt sooner or later, but I don't want to be controlling, and so I don't. The kids seem to be having fun, so I'll sort of let it go. But I hope Dad will recognize that probably somebody's going to get hurt sooner or later. And sure enough, the mom is about 99% likely to be right here. And somebody sooner or later, maybe not the first time they roughhouse, but the second or third time, somebody does get hurt. And Dad says, "Well, Billy, you can't stick your elbow in your sister's eye like that in order to win at the roughhousing." "Okay, Dad, I got it. So let's go back to the roughhousing." And so Dad goes back to the roughhousing, but then some version of that happens again. And Dad says, "That was not assertive, that was aggressive." And the kid is learning, well, assertive versus aggressive, what's the difference here? But Dad explains the difference, but and then says, if you do that again, there's going to. I warned you about that the last time. Now that's the end of roughhousing until a few days later. If you do all your chores and stuff like that, then we'll return to it. And so the mother is going berserk that the father hasn't learned the lesson from the fact that somebody was hurt the first time around, and thinks that the father's a little bit crazy. Um, and it convinces her that he in fact is just one more child to monitor. But what nobody gets, and the mom doesn't get this, the dad doesn't get it, and the dad doesn't explain it to the mom, and moms can't hear what dads don't say, so I don't blame this on the mom. But what nobody gets is that it's usually that second time around, after the dad says that you'll lose the roughhousing if you continue this behavior that is insensitive to your brother, your sister, or that's aggressive and not assertive. Then you'll lose the roughhousing. And then the next time the children do that, he does usually stop the roughhousing. So what he's doing is very important here. It's boundary enforcement as opposed to boundary setting. Boundary setting was saying, what you need to do is be aware, empathetic to your sister's need, to your brother's need, to not have an elbow put in the eyes or to be pushed away in an aggressive type of way. So but by the boundary being enforced, and not just what the mom is more likely to do, and sometimes the roles are reversed. What the mom is more likely to do is to repeat the boundary setting, like you can't do that. And when the dad enforces it, oftentimes the children will cry, like, "Well, why are you doing this? You're so mean to us." And but the dad is usually okay with, once he's said something once, that if it's not followed through with, the children should learn that lesson rather than keep repeating himself. And so that boundary enforcement, if we look at that closely there, what it taught the children was 3 things. One was postponed gratification. That is, to not that what the child wanted immediately, immediate gratification, was to push sister or brother aside and be aggressive in order to win at the roughhousing. But in order to get the roughhousing to continue, she or he had to postpone their gratification of pushing their sister or brother aside in order to win immediately. And postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure in life.
Huh.
Second, the child was learning empathy. And this, the data showed that children that roughhouse with their dad in this type of way become more empathetic. And but I've never heard a dad say to a mom, I'd like to roughhouse with the children. I think it will increase their empathy. That's like the most counterintuitive thing that could be mentioned. But the reason the empathy is increasing is because
Interesting.
the child learns that it's going to lose what it wants to have, the roughhousing and the bonding with the dad, if it
Yes.
doesn't consider sisters or brothers' feelings or understand the difference between being aggressive versus assertive. And so the child, by
Big
learning
to
what
learn.
is huge to learn, as I know we both know. And when you take those learning experiences into the school system, for example, and instead of having immediate gratification when somebody calls and says, "Let's do a video game together," and the child says, "No, I have to finish my homework first," that child tends to succeed. That child tends to get the rewards from teachers and ultimately respect from other people at school. And if it's a boy, boys learn when they turn 13, 14, 15, or whenever they start dating, that girls are not that interested in dating losers. They're interested in dating winners, and often winners are people who have the discipline to have that postponed gratification. So it leaves the boy less likely to be depressed, and in extreme cases, less likely to be suicidal. And so all of these things happen without anybody knowing that they happen. And again, dads were not able to read this in books, and so, or in magazines. I didn't find this, and so that was my incentive for putting all these differences in the Boy Crisis book, and just an example of why mothers and fathers, by understanding what the other one contributes, the important
Contribution.
contributions that each mom and dad have, and learning how to negotiate what I call checks and balance parenting, to get for mom and
That's
dad to
a great thing.
negotiate.
What is checks and balance therapy?
An example of what checks and balance parenting might be where, let's say the child says, "Mom, I want to climb the tree in the backyard," and the mom goes, "Well, sweetie, maybe in a few years, yes, but that's a big tree, and you could fall out. You could really hurt yourself." And so the kid runs to the dad and says, "Can I climb that tree in the backyard?" And the dad goes, "Well, that's a big tree, but okay, just be very careful." And then the child begins to climb the tree, and the mom goes, "Wait a minute! I told you you couldn't climb the tree." And the child says, "Well, Dad says,
Right.
I could, if as
I
long as I'm
like that
careful."
approach.
Yes,
Say,
right.
Warren, just to jump in here for a second, you
Yes,
became a father to, or stepfather, or both, to, I think they were early, maybe 9 or 10, or maybe teenage young girls. And what did
six,
you have to learn?
six, 6 and 7. Um, One thing I learned is that as a stepdad, especially if you're a stepdad to two girls who are 6 and 7, that this boundary enforcement is a really tough one to negotiate with the mom, because there's a part of the mom that is like almost every night I would talk to Liz, my wife, and who I met 30 years ago, and and she would agree with me about the value of the boundary enforcement. But when it came to actually doing it herself, she almost always moved in the protective mode and the repeating mode, and not the boundary enforcement mode. And there was a part of her, I think, that believed that because they weren't my biological children, that maybe I was too tough with them, even though I'm not a tough type of personality. And so there was this tension that she felt between uh, wanting to protect the children from any type of thing that would make them cry, and versus me, who felt that it was really important that once you said something, that you then followed through and enforced the boundary rather than just repeating it over and over again. And so the checks and balance parenting would be that mother and father saying something like, um, the you know sweetie, you can, the dad and mom talking about it and saying, okay, here's what we come to the conclusion of, which is, you can, yes, you can climb the tree, but not beyond this level, and not on these branches, which are too fragile and they might break. And dad, you have to be underneath the tree, so that in case the child falls out of the tree, that you can protect the child from hitting his or her head too hard, getting a concussion or getting a really major injury. And dad, let me take the cell phone away from you so you don't get preoccupied with that while you are watching the child climb the tree. So the child then gets the best of both worlds. And the best of both worlds, often not understood, is that a child climbing a tree is actually increasing his or her intelligence, because synapses are firing when the child is having to figure out what is safe and what is not safe. And so depriving the child of those types of internal calculations is depriving the child. But on the other hand, the child falling out of a tree and hurting itself in a major way would be depriving the child to not have that protection. And so the mother and father begin in checks and balance parenting to hear the value of the other parent's contribution and figure out a win-win way of giving the child the best of both worlds.
You're amazing. You just didn't say, I'm deferring to you, and you stuck it out. Good for you, Warren. That's tricky at more than one level in relationships. We're in different times in relationships, are we, or am I imagining it?
Oh no, you very rarely misimagine anything, Junia. You usually have.
That's a compliment. I'm taking it as a compliment.
Yeah, that's a total compliment. You have a very good perception of the world. The Yes, we are in. Unfortunately, we are in times where surv- in the era of, so in the boy crisis is a crisis in all 56 of the largest developed nations. And the key word is not 56, but developed. In developed nations, there's usually, in the middle and upper middle class, enough capacity to survive that you can begin to let go of some of the rigidities that were necessary when survival was pretty much universally needed. And so one of those things that was necessary when survival was needed was to not allow the society to not allow for a divorce. So many people lived miserable lives, but it was better to have them survive than to have them break up and have the freedom to divorce, or to have the freedom to raise a child, um, without the other parent. So the good news was that there was freedom. The bad news is that the children only had oftentimes one parent, and the children did not benefit to the degree that they otherwise did when there were two parents. And so it became, so as and of all the countries in the world where survival is most taken care of in the middle and upper middle class, the United States exceeds in that area. And so permission for divorce and to raise children as a single mother, that is the focus on freedom, that is what surfaces as an option when survival needs are taken care of. Freedom became more and more focused upon, and the need to raise children with both parents became less and less focused. When you combine that with the women's movement, you had a combination of freedom, plus that if there is somebody who needs to have more freedom, the right to the children was given to moms, and dads had to fight for children rather than have the right to the children. and that left many, many children without their dads. And that led to a large degree to the boy crisis, especially in those developed nations that where survival was more easily manageable, and therefore freedom took over. And so when the children did not have that boundary enforcement, and the mom was protecting without the dad having that checks and balance with them, oftentimes the children grew up very entitled and self-centered. Moms are often extremely empathetic, and empathy is a wonderful characteristic for every human being to have. But the problem is when empathy comes just to the child, it does not create an empathetic child. It creates a self-centered child. And so empathy has to be a two-way street that comes from the parents to the child, but also is required of the child to develop empathy for what the father and mother are going through, for what sister and brother are going through, with what other kids at school are going through, what the teachers are dealing with. And so it has to be something that is applied by the child. One-way empathy does not create empathy in a child. It creates self-centeredness. And we're dealing a lot more with that these days.
Hello, I'm Junia Doan. You have just been watching an interesting interview I had with Warren Farrell, American political scientist, speaker, and best-selling author on men's and women's issues. Due to the length of our wonderful conversation, I've decided to create a two-part series. Please tune in next week when Warren and I continue our conversation on the topic of responsibility, or you can visit my website at juniadoan.com and search for Warren Farrell. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Thank you for watching.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadonsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadonsthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.